The first thing my wife said in family court was directed at the judge, but she said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Your Honor," she said, "my husband spent 30 years playing soldier and came home a ghost. He's been useless to me for the last decade, and now he wants me to pay for it." I remember the sound of the air vents in that courtroom. How still everything got after she finished. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the way fluorescent lights always do in government buildings across this country. That particular hum that makes you feel like you're waiting on something that may never come. I looked at my wife for a long moment. 31 years of marriage, sitting across from me in a dark gray blazer. I didn't recognize. Her hair cut shorter than I remembered. Her hands folded in her lap like she was in church. She wouldn't meet my eyes after she said it. Then I looked at the judge. He was maybe 50, reading glasses pushed down his nose. A Tim Hortons cup sitting on the corner of his desk. He'd been reaching for a pen when my wife spoke. His hand stopped in midair when I turned toward him. "Corporal Holloway," I said quietly. "Patrick Holloway." The pen dropped. He stared at me the way a man stares when his mind refuses to accept what his eyes are showing him. Then he stood up, slowly at first, like his legs weren't sure they wanted to cooperate. His chair rolled back against the wall. "Murray Brennan," he said. Not a question, just the words, barely above a whisper. "My wife's lawyer," a sharp-dressed man from Ottawa named Alec Drummond, looked from the judge to me with the expression of someone who had just stepped onto ice he wasn't sure would hold. He'd spent the previous 40 minutes explaining to the court why I was a liability. A man who had served 28 years in the Canadian Forces, only to return home, emotionally hollowed out, unable to hold a normal conversation, prone to anxiety in public places, unwilling to seek proper help. He'd used the word burden twice and seemed pleased with himself for it. Now he wasn't pleased with anything. Judge Holloway removed his glasses slowly. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," he said. My wife looked confused for the first time all morning. Her lawyer looked like he'd swallowed something wrong, and I just sat there with my hands flat on the table, feeling every one of my 63 years settle into the places where the cold always found me first. The shoulder I tore in January of 1998, the knee that gave out in Kandahar, the back that had been arguing with me since Bosnia. That was the moment my wife realized she might not have known the man she married as well as she thought. But to explain how we got there, I need to go back a ways. I grew up in Pembroke, Ontario, in a house a few blocks from the Ottawa River. My father drove a delivery truck. My grandfather served in Korea and never talked about it, which I understand now in a way I couldn't when I was young. Half the men in Renfrew County had somebody who'd worn a uniform at some point. Joining up felt less like a decision and more like water finding its level. I joined the Canadian Forces at 19. Germany before the wall came down, then Cyprus, then Croatia in the early 90s, which was the kind of posting that aged a man in ways he couldn't see in a mirror. Then Kandahar in 2006, which I try to discuss as little as possible even now. 28 years total. Most of it I kept to myself. Men from my generation were built a certain way about that. You carried it quietly. You didn't put it on the table at dinner. You folded it up and put it somewhere out of the way and told yourself you'd deal with it later, and then later never quite arrived. I met my wife at a Legion Hall dance outside Arnprior in the spring of 1992. She laughed at something I said. I honestly can't remember what, and I thought she had the kind of laugh that made a room feel smaller in a good way. We were married 14 months later in a small church outside of town. Our son was born in 1995. For a long time, things were good, not glamorous. Good the way that real things are. Mortgage payments, Saturday morning pancakes, driving our boy to hockey practice in the dark at 6 in the morning in January. A small brick house near CFB, Petawawa, close enough to the Ottawa River that you could smell it when the wind came off the water. But retirement does something to some men. The structure that had kept everything in order disappeared overnight. The nightmares that were manageable when I had somewhere to be every morning became less manageable when I didn't. Grocery stores, Loblaws, Canadian Tire, didn't matter. Started making my chest tight the moment I walked through the automatic doors. Some mornings I'd sit in my truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to talk myself into going inside to buy something as ordinary as a tube of caulking. My wife thought I was choosing to shut her out. I wasn't. I just didn't know how to explain something. I barely understood myself. Men from my generation weren't given a vocabulary for that kind of thing. So instead I went quiet. And silence, I've since learned, is its own kind of damage. Over the years, she began spending more time with friends from her real estate office in Renfrew. Wealthier people. Women with cottages on Calabogie Lake, rather than the worn-out camp we owned up near Combermere. Women whose husbands drove new trucks and took them south in February and didn't flinch when somebody dropped something behind them at a restaurant. I think I became an embarrassment to her slowly, the way snow accumulates. You don't notice it until you open the door one morning and can't get out. She asked for a divorce last March. We were sitting at the kitchen table with our morning coffee. CBC radio was on in the background. She said she'd given it a long time to get better and it hadn't, and she felt she owed it to herself to stop waiting. I nodded, sat with it. You can survive things overseas that would make a civilian's hair stand straight up and still find yourself completely unprepared for a quiet conversation at your own kitchen table. I let her keep the furniture. I agreed to list the house. I offered to split my Canadian Forces pension and whatever was left in the RRSP without much argument. What I couldn't reconcile was the way 31 years could be reduced, in a courtroom, to a liability column on a spreadsheet. During the recess, the bailiff directed me through a side door and down a narrow hallway that smelled like old carpet and photocopier toner. That particular smell every government building in Ontario seems to share. Judge Holloway's chambers were smaller than I expected. Bookshelves, floor to ceiling, a framed map of the Ottawa Valley, a small brass model of a beaver float plane on the windowsill. The moment the door closed, he just looked at me. 25 years disappeared between us like smoke off the river. You got old, Murray, he finally said. So did you, I told him. He shook his head slowly. Then he crossed the room and put his hand out, and when I took it, he used his other hand to grip my forearm the way you do when words don't quite cover it. I looked for you, he said, for years. That surprised me genuinely. I transferred, I told him. Petawawa, then Trenton, then Afghanistan happened. He nodded slowly, sat behind his desk. We were both quiet in the way that only people who share a particular night can be quiet together. January 1998, he said finally. Every time the temperature drops below -20, I said. He opened his desk drawer and removed something small wrapped in a cloth. When he set it on the desk between us, I saw it was a folded piece of paper, a photocopy of an emergency duty roster. From that winter. My name circled in ballpoint pen that had bled with age and moisture. I kept this, he said. I didn't know what to say to that. The ice storm of January 1998 is the kind of event that people in Eastern Ontario still describe to their grandchildren. 3 days of freezing rain that coated everything. Power lines, trees, roads, farmhouses, in a shell of ice 4 centimeters thick. 40,000 people lost power across Renfrew County alone. Some lost it for weeks. Hydro towers collapsed under the weight. Rural roads became impassable. People were stranded in vehicles that had slid into ditches and couldn't force the doors open against the ice. I was a master corporal at the time, 26 years old, assigned to an emergency response team out of CFB Petawawa. We worked 12-hour rotations checking back roads and concession routes for stranded civilians. No plows could reach most of them. We went on foot in places, pulling people out of vehicles and walking them to the nearest community center or church hall. It was the second night, around 11 o'clock, on a concession road east of Renfrew. No lights anywhere. Power had been out since the morning before. My headlamp threw maybe 5 meters of useful light. The ice on the road surface made a sound when you walked on it, like stepping on glass. We found the car, a blue Civic, older model, nose down in the ditch where it had slid off a curve. A large elm tree had come down across the rear half of the vehicle. The ice made the bark look like chrome. The driver's door was jammed shut. Inside was a young man. He told me later he was 25, finishing his second year of law school at the University of Ottawa, home for the weekend to see his parents in Eganville. He'd been in that car for 4 hours when we found him. The temperature outside was minus 26 with wind chill. He'd burned through the last of his gas trying to stay warm. His fingers, when I finally reached him, had gone white at the tips. We couldn't move the tree without equipment, and the equipment was 2 hours away. I sent my partner back toward the road to flag anyone down, and I stayed with that young man, talking to him through a gap I managed to pry open in the window. At some point, the roof started to creak in a way I didn't like. The weight of the ice and the tree shifting against the frame. I made a decision. I jammed a pry bar from our kit into the door frame and hauled on it until something gave. Tore up my shoulder in the process. Never healed right after. Didn't seem like the time to dwell on it. I got him out. We walked 1.5 kilometers in the dark to a farmhouse that had a wood stove going. He shook my hand at the farmhouse door and said he'd find a way to repay me. I told him hot chocolate would cover it. We both laughed. I went back to work. I forgot about him by the end of that rotation. There were 40 other people that week. Apparently, he didn't forget. Back in his chambers, Judge Holloway leaned forward with his hands folded on the desk. "I want to ask you something directly," he said. "Go ahead. Did you hide assets? Any accounts she doesn't know about? Pension income she can't see?" "No." "Did you ever threaten her? Intimidate her in any way?" I looked at him steadily. "Not once." He nodded once. No follow-up. Outside, rain had started against the windows. October in the Ottawa Valley comes in cold and mean. I could hear it ticking against the glass. "Her lawyer's argument," he said carefully, "is essentially that your military service left you psychologically impaired and that this constitutes a form of long-term neglect." I know. Are you angry about it? I thought about my wife. The woman who used to make butter tarts from scratch every Christmas and leave one on the counter specifically for me because she knew I ate them before the tin was even cooled. The woman who held my hand through my father's funeral in 2011 without saying a word, which was exactly right. The woman who now sat across a courtroom from me in a blazer I'd never seen. "No," I said, mostly tired. He was quiet a moment. Then he opened a manila folder on his desk. "Murray," he said, "after you left Petawawa, I made some inquiries. I found people who'd served with you." He turned the folder toward me. Inside were letters. Handwritten ones, typed ones, some on lined notebook paper, some on proper letterhead. A former corporal I'd helped get into a provincial recovery program after he came home from Kandahar and couldn't find his footing. A widow near Trenton whose hydro and heating bills I'd covered 2 winters running after her husband, died of a heart attack, and left her with a mortgage she couldn't manage on her own. A letter from a young private who wrote in a careful, deliberate hand, "You came and sat with me in that parking lot at CFB Trenton in 2009 until I gave you my sidearm. I have a daughter now. Her name is Emma. I don't know if you even remember me, but I remember you every single day." I looked away from that last one fairly quickly. "You kept these," I said. "People don't forget the ones who showed up," he said quietly. For a moment I couldn't say anything. Because the truth about getting older is that after enough years pass, you begin to believe that maybe you didn't matter the way you once thought you might. That the things you did quietly, without anyone watching, dissolved into the air like everything else. The judge closed the folder carefully. "The courtroom out there thinks this case is about property division," he said. "I think it might be about something else entirely." He was right. I just hadn't been able to name it until that moment. It was about whether a man's worth could be measured by what he'd accumulated. Whether 31 years of marriage and 28 years of service added up to anything a courtroom could recognize. When we walked back into the courtroom together, the room went quiet. The way rooms go quiet when people understand that something has shifted without knowing exactly what. My wife looked at me differently than she had that morning. Not frightened. More like someone trying to work out a puzzle they hadn't seen all the pieces of before. Her lawyer stood up immediately. Your Honor, I must insist that the record reflect. The record reflects whatever I say it reflects, Mr. Drummond, the judge said pleasantly. Sit down. Drummond sat down. Proceedings resumed. Financial testimony, pension valuations, CPP projections, the house assessment, the camp near Combermere, the ordinary arithmetic of a marriage ending. But underneath all of it, something had changed. The way people in that room looked at me had shifted. Earlier that morning, I had been a case study in emotional unavailability. Now people kept glancing at me the way you glance at something you aren't entirely sure you've correctly identified. During a pause in testimony, my wife leaned toward me. What did you say to him? She asked quietly. Nothing special. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Maybe he just remembered something. She studied me for a long moment. Murray, what happened in that room? I kept my eyes forward. Old business. Outside the courthouse windows, rain moved in sheets across the parking lot. The maples on the street had gone full October, yellow and orange, and a deep red that always makes me think of the valley in a way I can't quite put into words. There's a specific quality to autumn light in eastern Ontario that I've never found anywhere else in this country, or in the world. The hearing adjourned until the following morning. When I pulled into the courthouse parking lot at 8:15 the next day, there were vehicles along both sides of the street that hadn't been there before. Older trucks, mostly. A couple of motorcycles despite the weather. Men standing around with Tim Hortons cups, collars turned up against the October wind. I recognized Dale Ferris before I was fully out of my truck. We'd served together in Croatia in 1993. He'd lost most of the hearing in his left ear on a road outside Sarajevo and had a way of tilting his head when he listened to you that I'd know anywhere. Heard you could use some company, he said, and stuck out his hand. Behind him, men kept arriving. Some I recognized immediately. Some took me a moment. There was a former corporal from my last Petawawa posting who'd nearly gotten himself discharged for insubordination until someone sat down with him long enough to understand what was underneath it. There was an older man I'd driven to a Veterans Affairs appointment in Pembroke 3 years back because he had no one else to take him. There was a retired warrant officer who I knew had driven 4 hours from Sudbury that morning because his name was on one of those letters in the judge's folder. They filed into the courthouse quietly. No noise, no spectacle, just men in worn jackets and Legion caps taking seats in the gallery behind me. My wife came in a few minutes after we did and stopped when she saw the gallery. Her lawyer stopped, too. They looked at each other the way people do when the thing they thought they understood turns out to be considerably larger than they'd accounted for. Drummond resumed his line of questioning, tried to reestablish the narrative he'd built the day before. He got to me on cross-examination and adjusted his jacket in the way people do when they're about to try something they're confident about. Mr. Brennan, he began, you'd agree that your emotional withdrawal significantly harmed this marriage? Yes, I said. He seemed surprised by how directly I said it, and that your service-related difficulties left you unable to participate fully in a healthy partnership. I said I carried damage, I told him. I didn't say I became incapable. He tilted his head slightly. What's the difference? I looked at my wife briefly before answering. The difference is I never stopped loving her. The room went still. My wife's eyes filled immediately. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table. Drummond recovered quickly. Love without communication is still a form of neglect, correct? He wasn't wrong about that. That was the hard part. I nodded. Sometimes, yes. He turned toward the judge with the expression of someone tallying up points. And then something happened that no one in that courtroom, including me, had anticipated. My wife spoke. That's enough. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Drummond turned around with obvious confusion. Mrs. Brennan. I said that's enough. She sat straighter in her chair, gripping a tissue in both hands. Her voice was unsteady but clear. "I'd like to say something." The judge looked at her. "You may." She set the tissue down. She looked at the gallery, at the men sitting there in their Legion caps and their worn jackets, and then she looked at me. "My husband was not cruel," she said. "He was not abusive. He was not dishonest. He was not lazy. He came home from things I never asked him about, and he carried them without complaint, and somewhere along the way I started calling that coldness." Her voice cracked slightly on that last word. It wasn't coldness. I just didn't understand what I was looking at. Drummond opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," she said quietly. He closed it. "I spent years comparing my life to other women's lives," she continued. "Women with bigger houses and newer cars and husbands who took them to the Muskokas in August. I told myself I'd settled, that I deserved more." She looked down at her hands. "I found some things in the house last week while I was packing. Pay stubs from 2010 and 2011. Security guard work. Night shifts. I didn't know he'd taken a second job." Drummond looked at me. I kept my face steady. "I also didn't know he'd sold his truck," she went on. "The old Silverado he'd had since he retired. I thought he'd traded it in. He sold it and used the money to cover 3 months of our son's residence fees at Queens when his student loan didn't come through on time." Her voice wavered. "Our son told me last week. He assumed I'd always known." The gallery was completely silent. My wife reached into her purse and removed a folded piece of notepaper. Her hands weren't entirely steady. "I also found this," she said, "in his bedside table." She unfolded it carefully. I knew immediately what it was. I'd written it 4 years ago during a winter that had been particularly bad for the dreams. She'd been waking up beside me 2 or 3 times a week for months, and I could see what it was doing to her. And I couldn't figure out how to fix it. So one night, I sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, and I wrote down what I couldn't seem to say out loud. I never gave it to her. Couldn't find the right moment, and eventually stopped believing there would be one. Her voice dropped as she read. "I know this isn't what you signed up for. I know some nights must feel like living beside a stranger. I want you to know that none of it has ever been your fault, and that the man who married you in that church outside Arnprior is still here. He's just learned to keep very quiet. That was a survival skill once. I understand it doesn't feel like one now. I'm sorry I don't know how to unlearn it." By the time she finished, even Drummond looked like he was somewhere else. My wife set the letter on the table and looked at me directly in front of everyone in that room. "Why didn't you give this to me?" I answered honestly. "I didn't think you'd want it anymore." She covered her mouth briefly with one hand. The judge let the silence hold for a moment before he spoke. "I think we have everything we need," he said quietly, "to proceed to a fair resolution." The settlement was finalized 6 weeks later. My wife kept the house in Renfrew. I didn't want it. Too many rooms that had gone quiet one by one over the years. I took a small rental property near Combermere, not far from the old camp. 1 bedroom, a wood stove, a screened porch that looked out over the lake. In September, the water sits so still in the mornings that you can see the tree line doubled in it. I started sleeping better almost immediately. Not perfectly, but better than I had in years. 2 mornings a week I drove into Renfrew to volunteer at the Legion, mostly administrative help. VAC benefit forms, driving men to medical appointments in Pembroke or Ottawa when they couldn't manage the trip themselves. A lot of veterans in Renfrew County are getting on in years. Some of them just need somebody to sit in the waiting room with them. Turns out that's not a small thing. One Tuesday in November, I was halfway through a stack of intake forms when I heard the door. My wife was standing in the doorway, holding a cardboard tray with 2 large double-doubles and a box of Timbits. The room got a particular quality of quiet. A few of the men knew her from the proceedings. Dale Ferris looked at his newspaper with the studied indifference of someone paying very close attention. My wife stood in the doorway. "I brought coffee," she said. Nobody moved for a moment. Then old Ray McAllister, 81 years old, Royal Canadian Navy, retired 4 decades, and still the most stubborn man in the Ottawa Valley. Pointed at an empty chair near the table without looking up from his crossword. "Well, don't block the heat," he said. That was enough to break the room open a little. She sat down. Eventually, someone took a coffee. She came back the following week, and the week after. She helped with the winter clothing drive in December. She answered phones. She sat with a widow from Calabogie for nearly 2 hours one afternoon, just listening while the woman talked about her husband. She didn't try to fix anything. She didn't offer solutions. She just stayed. I watched from across the room, and she caught me watching. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. Our son noticed the change before anyone else named it. "I can actually call both of you in the same week without it feeling like international diplomacy," he said over the phone one evening, and I could hear him smiling. We started having Sunday dinners occasionally, mostly because of his daughter, Sophie. Sophie was 8 years old and asked questions the way 8-year-olds do, directly, without preamble, without apparently considering whether the question might be complicated. "Grandpa," she said one afternoon, while we were trying to get her to catch a pike off the dock at the old camp, "were you really a soldier?" I was. "Did you shoot people?" "Sophie," her mother said from her chair on the dock. "It's all right," I said. I thought about it a moment. I tried to help people, mostly. That was the job. Sophie absorbed this with the serious face of someone filing information carefully. "Judge Holloway came to our school," she said then. I turned to look at her. "He talked at the assembly. He said he knows you." I hadn't known about any of that. Sophie looked up at me with her line in the water. "He said you were the reason he became a judge." "Did he?" "He said you taught him that surviving something means you owe something back." She thought about this very carefully. "What does that mean?" I baited her hook again before I answered. "It means if someone helps you get through the hard part," I said. "The decent thing is to spend some of your time helping someone else get through theirs." Sophie seemed satisfied with this. She turned back to the water. In November, Sophie's school held a Remembrance Day assembly. The gymnasium smelled like floor wax and old gym shoes, the way every school gymnasium in this country smells without exception. Paper poppies taped to construction paper. Folding chairs in uneven rows. A projector screen at the front with the word Remembrance in block letters. Sophie had been asking me for 2 weeks to come. She'd told her entire class her grandfather was going to be there. The pressure was considerable for a man who generally prefers the back row. I went. My wife came too. We sat together near the back without discussing it much, which says something about where things had arrived between us. Near the end of the ceremony, the principal announced there would be a brief address from a special guest. Judge Patrick Holloway walked up to the small raised platform in a dark suit with note cards in hand. He spotted me in the back row immediately and gave me the particular look of a man who has been planning something and is pleased it's going according to plan. He spoke for several minutes about service and about what communities owe to the people who show up for them. He was measured and clear and didn't overreach. Then he paused and looked out at the gymnasium. "I'd like to tell you something about a man who's in this room today," he said. 2 rows ahead, I saw Sophie sit up straighter. 25 years ago, in the middle of an ice storm, this man pulled me out of a car on a dark road and walked me to safety when he could have waited for equipment and stayed warm. He made a different choice that night, and I went on to finish law school and eventually do the work I do now. He paused. "But here is the part I want you to understand. That wasn't the extraordinary thing. The extraordinary thing was that he never told anyone. He went back to his rotation, helped 30 more people that week, and never mentioned it again to a single person. The gymnasium was very quiet. Strength," Judge Holloway said, "almost never announces itself. In my experience, the most capable people in any room tend to be the quietest ones in it." He looked directly at me. "Marie Brennan," he said, "would you stand up?" Sophie turned around in her chair and found me with her eyes and looked at me with an expression I don't have words for. Pure, uncomplicated pride, with none of the complicated feelings adults attached to it. I stood up slowly. The room applauded. Not a roar, something quieter and more lasting than a roar. Teachers, parents, veterans, children. People who had no particular reason to know who I was, simply standing because someone had told them a true thing and they recognized it. I looked at my wife. She had her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were full. And this time, they didn't look like guilt. They looked like understanding, which is a different thing entirely, and in some ways harder to come by. After the assembly, Sophie took my hand in the parking lot as we walked toward the cars. The afternoon was cold and clear, the kind of November day in Ontario where the sky goes an impossible shade of blue, and the light comes in at an angle that makes everything look like a painting of itself. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "everybody clapped for you." "Crowds can be unreliable," I told her. She thought about this very seriously. "Judge Holloway said you were kind when nobody was watching," she said. "Is that what a hero is?" I looked at the sky for a moment. "It might be part of it," I said. "The rest is just showing up." That evening, my wife drove out to the camp. She had a casserole dish wrapped in a tea towel and a plastic container of butter tarts. She set them on the counter without ceremony. "You look thin," she said by way of explanation. We ate at the small table by the window with the lake going dark outside. We didn't talk about the lawyers or the house or the years between us that we'd failed to cross. We talked about our son and about Sophie's determination to catch a pike before the camp closed for the season, and about how the drive up Highway 60 in October was the one part of autumn she'd always loved and apparently still did. Before she left, she turned in the doorway. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what I said in that courtroom. For all of it, really." I nodded slowly. "I'm sorry I didn't learn how to let you in," I said. She was quiet for a moment, looking out past the porch toward the dark water. "We were both looking at the same thing," she finally said, "and seeing completely different pictures. I think that was the truest thing either of us managed to say through the whole of it." She drove down the camp road, and her taillights disappeared into the trees. I sat on the porch for a while in my jacket, with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, listening to the lake settle in the dark. I've learned, at 63, that peace and loneliness can look almost identical from a distance. The difference is what you carry into the quiet with you. That night, I carried something I hadn't had in a long time. The sense that someone had finally seen clearly, and that it wasn't too late for it to mean something. And if any part of this story brought someone to mind, a veteran, a spouse, a parent, or simply someone who has been carrying something alone for longer than they should have, I hope you'll take a moment to say something to them while there's still time to say it. Because the people who hold things together quietly are almost always the last ones the world thinks to thank.